Good evening, and welcome to today's panel conversation on workplace diversity, culture, and leadership. My name is Michael DELLI CARPINI. I'm a faculty member and the former dean of the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, and faculty director of the SNF Padilla program at Penn, whose mission is to facilitate robust, informed, and respectful dialogue on the many difficult, contentious issues facing the nation and the globe, and across the many ideological, cultural, and demographic divides that too often keep us from effectively addressing these issues. This panel is the second of 13 we will be holding over the course of this academic year as part of the preceptorial, which is essentially a non-credit bearing course on racism and anti-racism in contemporary America. The preceptorial is designed for Penn undergraduates, but each panel is open to the entire Penn community and to the larger public. I'm pleased to say that we have over 325 people registered for today's event. The preceptorial is sponsored by the SNF Padilla program and co-sponsored by a number of other important Penn centers and offices, including the Office of the Vice President for Social Equity and Community, the Office of the Provost, the Andrea Mitchell Center, Civic House, and New Student Orientation and Academic Initiatives, all as part of the year of civic engagement at Penn. Now, while inspired by recent events such as the murder of George Floyd and the resulting protests, demonstrations, and calls for change that emerged from them, this series of panel discussions is designed to explore the ways in which racism has long been embedded in our country's economic, housing, public health, criminal justice, education, cultural, media, and political systems, to better understand the root causes of this structural racism and to identify what we have or might do to address these inequalities. Today's panel focuses on the nature and impact of racism on workplace diversity, workplace culture, and workplace leadership. I should note to the audience that you can use the Q&A function on your screens to ask questions. While we won't be able to answer all of them directly, we'll leave some time towards the end of today's panel for me to ask our panelists some of them on your behalf. Now, we have a stellar panel today to address today's issues and your questions, who I will now very briefly introduce. So can I ask the panelists to please unmute your videos right now? First is Dr. Anita Allen, the Henry R. Silverman Professor of Law and Professor of Philosophy at Penn. Dr. Allen is an internationally renowned expert on privacy law and ethics and is recognized for her contributions to legal philosophy, women's rights, and diversity in higher education. She was also served as Vice Provost of Faculty from 2010 to 2017 at Penn, in which role she led Penn's efforts to increase faculty diversity and inclusion. Our second panelist is Dr. Jaya Aysola. Dr. Aysola is an assistant professor of medicine and assistant professor of pediatrics, with her primary appointment in the Division of General Internal Medicine in the Perelman School of Medicine at Penn. As a clinician investigator, her research centers on evaluating system, provider, and patient-level strategies to improve the uptake and quality of healthcare and health for vulnerable populations, research that stems from her clinical, administrative, and policy experiences in resource-poor settings. In addition, since 2018, she has been serving as the first Assistant Dean for Inclusion and Diversity at Penn Medicine. Next is Dr. Stephanie Creary. Dr. Creary is an assistant professor of management at Penn's Wharton School and an identity and diversity scholar and field researcher. She's also a founding faculty member of the Wharton Ideas Lab, standing for Identity, Diversity, Engagement, Affect, and Social Relationships, an affiliated member of the Wharton People Analytics, a senior fellow of the Leonard Davis Institute for Health Economics, and an affiliated faculty member of the Penn Center for Africana Studies. And last, but certainly not least, is Dr. Erika James. Dr. James is the new dean of the Wharton School and former dean of the business school at Emory University. An expert on crisis leadership, management, and workplace discrimination, Dean James was named as one of the top 10 women of power in education by Black Enterprise and included on the Power 100 list by Amity Magazine. Thank you all for being here tonight. Now, while today's panel is focused on workplace diversity and future panels in this series will focus explicitly on the criminal justice system and on the political system, I would be remiss if I didn't give the panelists a chance to reflect on two important recent events. The killing of Walter Wallace Jr. just a few blocks from Penn's campus, and the recent presidential election, the result of which remains contested by President Trump, and the outcome of which will have major implications for issues of race in the United States. So let me start with Jaya. Jaya, do you have any thoughts or reactions that you'd like to share about either of these two recent events?
Sure. Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. And also to all of you, it's a pleasure to be with you this evening to talk about these critical topics. I think as I reflect about the tragic killing of Mr. Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia, again underscores the pervasiveness of this public health crisis and how no state or city is immune, irrespective of their diversity. We have no ethnic majority here in Philadelphia or their politics. We voted resoundingly for one candidate in the election. And I think it really points towards the need for all of us to evaluate the critical role that racism plays across all of our social systems and how it impacts the public health of our communities. And I think this panel is so timely because a critical component of fixing these social systems is ensuring that we diversify the perspectives all along the levels of the systems at play.
That's great. Thank you very much. Anita, any thoughts on either of these two recent events?
Thank you, Michael. I just want to say that, like all Americans right now, I'm struck by how profoundly divided we are. And the big questions on my mind, and I'm sure most people's mind, are first, what's the path forward? How do we get beyond this great divide and continue to live as communities and govern ourselves? And then the second question, I think that's so important for all of us, is what should we as individuals do? I was last Tuesday fixed on the television set and asking myself, regardless of how this comes out, what will my role be moving forward? How can I help? And one response I had was to think about what changes I could make in the way that I teach and what I teach my students. And I did decide that night that I was going to teach privacy and data protection law in a different way. I was going to teach it through the lens of race and see how technology and surveillance are affecting the lives of not just African Americans, but all American minorities who are living in our cities and are underserved. On the question of the tragic death of Walter Wallace, I have, as it happens, a son who's exactly his age with exactly his mental health profile. And my family, we live in the Philadelphia suburbs, and we have had to call the police at least a dozen times. And the mental health community, the doctors, the social workers advise families to call the police. That is the only option that we are given as families, call the police. And in the context of the bad relationship between African American men and women and the police, it's not a very good solution to the problem. The fact of the matter is many young men do suffer with bipolar disorder, various kinds of conduct disorders and problems, and families want to protect and love those family members. They don't want them killed. We need to radically rethink how we intervene in the lives of people affected by mental illness.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, and couldn't agree more with you. It's just tragic. It's tragic. Stephanie, thoughts on either of the two recent events that I mentioned?
Yeah, thank you for having me here and inviting me to share some of my comments on these two events. So tragically, the day that Walter Wallace was killed was my first day of teaching,
Oh,
since March. And so it happened at the end of my first day of teaching. And so I knew that I needed to go back into the classroom and say something to the students. And I just want to say I'm happy that both Penn and I'm in the Wharton School gave a very public response to this tragic killing that has not historically always been the stance that we've taken. And I think it meant a lot to a lot of people. I also want to acknowledge that for our Black community, our Black students, our Black faculty and Black staff, this is especially traumatic because it's another racially traumatizing event. And I think as we begin to respond to these events and understand them happening, they're impacting us differently. And so I was really happy that a number of my colleagues had reached out to me and said, I don't know what that might be like because I'm not Black, but I know that this might be affecting you differently. Just know that I'm here. And I think if more people can do stuff like that and recognize that there is a conversation that this is affecting us all, but for our Black students, faculty, and staff, it's perhaps even more traumatizing. If we could be, again, to continue reaching out to one another, I think it's really important. In the same token, something really important and wonderful happened recently that is creating a lot of positivity for these same groups of people, for our Black students, faculty, and staff. And that was the election of Kamala Harris to the vice president role. That means so much to, I know, so many of us, to women, but especially our Black students, faculty, and staff. To them, it just means that there is hope. And so I'm excited to be here to have this conversation with you all. It's an interesting paradox. At the same time, bad things are happening, good things are happening as well. And I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
thank you so much. Yeah, paradox is a good way to put it. It is being pulled in many different directions right now. Erika.
Yes, thank you, Michael. And I think one of the challenges with being the fourth on a panel of tremendously talented colleagues is that they say all of the things and there's not much more to add. Like Anita, I will share that I also have a Black son who is 6'4" and almost 19 years old. And the fear that I live with about him having the experience, or our family having the experience, of far too many Black men and women in this country it's quite dreadful, frankly. I am also inspired by a level of connectivity and outreach and empathy and care and concern that is coming from so many people. There's an awareness that I have not seen in the likes of my lifetime, for sure. And excuse me, that awareness, I think, was precipitated by the events of this summer and have just continued. And I am hopeful more than ever that this is not just a superficial concern, that the society that we call home is much more intentional about their commitment and responsibility and the impact that these kinds of tragic events are having, not only on the Black community, but quite frankly, the impact that losing these lives means for the entirety of the United States. So I feel like I'm hoping, are reaching a place where we really are committed to societal change moving forward.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I mean, I feel that. I definitely feel that this feels different than past moments, but I find myself always checking that feeling because I have felt it in the past, and so I hope we are right. I hope you are right on this. Well, thank you for those thoughts, both personal and more general on that. Let's turn to the topic of today's panel now. I'd like to start by giving the audience a sense of where we stand as a country on diversifying our various workplaces, our workplace cultures, and our workplace leadership. And Erika, I'll start with you this time, so you don't have to be last. And could you just talk a little bit, given your expertise in this area? I realize this is a broad question, but what is the current state of American workplaces as regards race? I know it varies by sector, so you can talk about it, and even by individual companies and entities. Is it improving? Does it vary by sector? Anything you can tell us to paint a picture of what workplaces look like now?
Yeah, so it is a broad question. By and large, we are not that different in 2020 than we were in 2000, than we were in 1980, than we were in 1960 in some respects. For a number of years, there's an organization that's called the Executive Leadership Council, which is a membership organization for Black executives and CEOs of companies whose mission is to try to promote and advance Black individuals within organizations in the corporate sector. And there was a period of time where I did their annual report on Blacks on corporate boards, for example. Mm-hmm. And every other year that we did this report, the data was by and large the same. So you just had this sense of frustration that there's talk and conversation about commitment to diversity, and yet the data never revealed that diversity was happening. I will say that by and large, we tend to focus on the representation. So meaning the numbers, how many diverse people can enter an organization. And over the decades, there has been some shift in outreach to having more underrepresented minorities enter organizations. But where companies are continuing to fall short is, how do we retain that talent in the organization in such a way that they have the opportunity to advance and grow and contribute and feel the same kind of value that white colleagues are having. And we are clearly not there yet. Otherwise, we would see more than 3 or 4 or 5 Black CEOs at a time. We'd see more than a small percentage of companies that have Blacks on their corporate boards. So while there has been effort in trying to get people into the organizations, we're falling woefully short on being able to retain them at the levels and see them advance at levels that are consistent with their counterparts.
Thank you. It's good. I mean, I did a little, since this is not an area I'm an expert in, a little bit of research, and I was amazed, confirming the point you made, that almost every article I found, whether it was about the field of journalism or academia or corporate world, the titles were all what some variation of why haven't things improved. It's just it can be hard to look at. Stephanie, would you like to add anything from your own experience with this and expertise?
Yeah, sure. So 2 points. One is, like Erika, I've been beating on this drum for some time in both research teaching and practice, and also exposed to some of the same audiences who, by and large, continue to track progress by representation numbers, and hence know that there has not been a lot of progress because those numbers don't change, and don't always measure the culture. So for the last 2 years, some of my colleagues and I, Nancy Rothbard, who is our department chair in management, and our PhD student, Jared Scruggs, and I, through Wharton People Analytics, with now 10 MBA students over the years, have been trying to answer the larger question around what works or what doesn't work when it comes to changing people's workplace experiences. So we're not focusing on representation, we're focusing on culture, we're focusing on inclusion, belonging, speaking up, a whole host. We have 12 outcomes that we're measuring, and we're 2 years in, we're finishing our last year of data collection in real companies. And in spring, we're hoping to release this report, which intends to push this conversation forward scientifically, but also in a way that helps these organizations to understand what else they could measure. What we've learned about these organizations is they don't always have the capacity They don't necessarily have the expertise to begin to understand, how do you measure inclusion? How do you measure belonging? Representation they get. And so what we've learned is how do we, as a community of scholars, and certainly as an academic institution such as Wharton, what is the service that we can offer to people in organizations who are who know that they need. It's not that they don't know that they need to measure culture, it's that they don't always understand the right way to get at it. So we've been working on that. I want to say my last point here is I've been really impressed by the work that McKinsey and Lean In have done around the state of women in corporate America, but more recently, the state of Black women in corporate America. And we often did not have those statistics. And so on all dimensions, even though this is still about representation and not necessarily about culture, we know that Black women are significantly underrepresented across the board in middle management, on boards, in the vice presidency, positions of corporate organizations, and senior leadership. They're less likely to have advocates. They're less likely to have mentors and sponsors. They're less likely to have interactions with senior leaders who are really important to their promotions. They're more likely to have their competence questioned. They're more likely to feel scrutinized. But they're the most likely, Black women are the most likely, given all that negative stuff I said, they're the most likely to want to raise their hand to influence the culture and positively affect cultural change. So I think that is really important to be said. I think, I've mentioned Black women, but women of color still outperform white women and white men, or men as a whole, in their willingness to want to promote culture change. I don't think it's surprising that the 4 speakers on today's panel today are women of color.
That's a really great point, and the same could be said in other areas. I do work in political communication and participation, and a lot of the credit for the turnout in this current election goes to Black women, and they are also underappreciated in the realm of politics as well. The issue of representation versus culture is an interesting one. In my role as dean, we struggled with that when I was the dean of Annenberg, but I found myself leaning towards the idea that while you can affect culture, you almost have to have diverse representation before you can truly affect culture, as opposed to creating a culture where basically, to put not too fine a point on it, you have a lot of white people trying to figure out how to make a culture diverse, feel welcoming to those who are not white, and so it's hard to disentangle those, and maybe we can talk more about that when we talk about causes and solutions to problems. But Anita, I know you did a lot of work in this area, not only in your work more generally and your own teaching in life, but especially as vice provost. What would you like to add on this issue of what diversity in culture, leadership, and representation looks like right now?
So, focusing specifically on the higher education field, we've seen in the corporate sector and elsewhere in the society that the numbers are small of people of color, women of color being part of the establishment. The number of tenure track women and people of color has increased in higher education, thankfully, but not anything close to what you might say would be representative in terms of the proportion of such people in the country. Native Americans are woefully underrepresented in higher education. Hispanics and African Americans are still underrepresented minorities in higher education. Asians are well represented, but there are lots and lots of problems facing Asian women, especially from countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, some of the smaller Asian countries. So we have a lot of work to do. And we did do a lot of good things at Penn. And I'm very proud that we did increase what we call, I don't like this word headcount, but we increased the headcount of women and underrepresented minorities while I was vice provost for faculty, with the help of great deans like Michael Della Carpini. We did make some progress, but we have a lot of progress to go. And this business about culture versus representation is very important. I think that we have to be careful that we don't give up on some of the goals of representation, because I do think it's true that you can't change the culture unless you have people who know and understand the culture as part of the organization. I like to focus on the why, though. Like, why does diversity matter? Why do we care about diverse leadership? Why does it matter if your provost is African American or your president is a woman? Why does it matter? Well, I'd like to focus on the why, and the why for me is that we really are a better university with better ideas, more perspectives, better mentorship, more opportunities to reach out into the community and have an impact through helping underserved communities if our faculty and our student body and our staff is highly diverse. And that's just, I think, an uncontrovertible fact that diversity is important to achieve those ends. And in addition to that, another set of whys has to do just with equal opportunity. I mean, there's no reason why smart people in medicine or veterinary medicine or dental medicine or English or business law should not be able to find a place in our universities. And therefore, for that talent to get the fair shake it deserves, we need to really fight the unconscious bias and the racism and the prejudices and the stereotypes that keep diverse people out of higher education.
Those are all great points, and thank you for mentioning the why, because that sometimes gets missed. And it is a matter of social justice and opportunity, but it is also a matter of improving the institutions that you're in. I serve on the Lenfest Institute board, which is the board that the institute that technically owns the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they are struggling in very serious ways and very productive ways on the issue of diversity. But one of the things they realize is that their ability to produce content that is of value to the Philadelphia community is deeply tied to the ability of having a diverse workforce from journalists all down and up, because it will affect the content that's produced in really positive ways. So it's a really good point. Thank you for that. Jaya, would you like to add anything to this conversation?
Yes, and I'll probably talk about it. Just want to echo what was already said, but also talk about it in the context of healthcare. I think similar to what Dean James said when she talked about the stagnant trends in the corporate sector, we can talk about the same thing in healthcare. We did a study last year that we looked at all U.S. medical schools and matriculants in U.S. medical students and looked at the racial and ethnic representation from 2002 to 2017. And while you found modest increases in the absolute numbers of racial and ethnic minorities, when you look at it in proportion to the growth in the population, those modest increases diminish. And so we have been relatively stagnant in our growth and representation upon entry into our graduate medical education at medical school level. And that has continued on at every level with additional leaks from medical students to residency to faculty and then to leadership within the healthcare sector. And I'd like to echo what Dr. Allen said as well around the sort of whys of diversifying our workforce. When I talk about the advancement portion of it, when we think about diversity in medicine, we've often talked about it only as diversifying our frontline workforce, but we really do need to diversify the scientists that are generating the medical knowledge that we're using, as well as the health system leaders that are designing our healthcare delivery systems, and really infusing diversity in those spaces are needed to eliminate structural racism within medicine. And that's the only way we're going to advance health equity. And so it is critical that we focus on diversity all along that pipeline, which we have a long ways to go. I was wanting to say a little bit about what Dr. Creary nicely articulated around inclusion. And we've done some work in inclusion as well, and the importance of that. I see the role of inclusion similar to Dean Higginbotham. I'm her protege, so I see it very similar to her in the sense that, you know, inclusion begets diversity. And we can argue about the chicken and the egg as somewhat, but I think if you think about recruitment as a revolving door, if we can't retain, it doesn't matter how many people we bring in. And if we can't advance and sponsor, it doesn't matter how many people we bring in. And culture is so paramount into ensuring whoever we bring in is able to advance within an organization and beget more recruitment because of that. And so I do believe there's needs to be a critical focus on culture. And we conducted a study to sort of understand how to operationalize inclusion within medicine, because I agree that it's sort of it's sort of a concept that needs to be demystified in terms of how organizations capture the key factors that drive inclusive cultures. And what we found was there was a systematic difference in perceptions of both culture and the feeling of that culture supporting them, with minorities and women far more interested in improving culture, as some of the findings that were talked about, but yet also being subject to what they felt were higher levels or unequal performance standards and microaggressions at the workplace, as well as unequal compensation and unequal sponsorship. They also reported greater infringements on their professionalism boundaries, while simultaneously endorsing greater, so they had greater scrutiny over their professionalism actions, as well as greater infringements on their professionalism boundaries at the same time. And they actually endorsed valuing professionalism more than their other colleagues and counterparts, and cited that as a reason to leave the organization.
Well, thank you for painting that picture, negative and unfortunate as it is.
Sorry.
Yes, please. Did you want to step in? Yeah.
To follow up on thoughts that were generated by all of the panelists, and that is, there's this sense, I believe, that it is the primary responsibility of people of color to sort of address the cultural issues and to do this work. And I think some of the findings that Stephanie recorded or communicated, you know, speak to how important we feel these issues are, and we have to be the bearers of this burden, if you will. And, you know, I'd like to share that one of the things that has been the most surprising to me about coming new to the University of Pennsylvania, to the Wharton School in particular, is how much interest I have found by white students, faculty, and staff about wanting to have these conversations and wanting to feel a part of an effort to make sustained change. And I actually have a question for my colleague, Stephanie, who's in the classroom and is teaching a class on diversity. And I've spoken with enough students who are white students who are talking about her class as if it is the best thing they've ever experienced. So I'm wanting to get Stephanie's perspective on what she's feeling and experiencing and hearing from students' interest engagement from non-students of color, actually.
So thank you for putting me on the spot, Erika. I really appreciate that. But the students who take my class, just so we're clear, they're mostly not racial ethnic minorities. The racial ethnic minority students are not signing up for my class. It is a lot of white students and other people who would not define themselves particularly as US racial ethnic minorities. And I think what the class offers is we just talk about all of the issues, and I give them all of the research, and I give them a lot of different frameworks. And I think I know the students' experience is of walking around Penn, walking around Wharton, walking around whatever school and college they're in. Their experience is one of silence, and my classroom is not a silent experience. Everybody's expected to learn, to engage. They're in breakout groups. And it's the culture of the classroom setting, and the topic is fundamentally very different from their daily lived experiences. And I would say that's what it offers. It's an intense experience around things that other people may be afraid to talk about. Today, we talked about race the entire day and what was behind our passions and our concerns in talking about race in the workplace. And they really only engaged in their peers. Erika was the intergroup dialogue method out of the University of Michigan, which I know you know. They said, the takeaways were, we only talked for 15 minutes, but I feel like I know this person better than anybody else who I would have had a 15-minute conversation with. And so it's not magic, it's science and practice. And I think the course just offers that experience to students who just don't feel like they have that opportunity elsewhere.
But I think what's so striking, and Michael, I don't mean to take over your
No, this is great. This is what I hoped would happen, Erika.
What I think is so striking, and maybe people are surprised or not surprised, that so many white students are wanting to engage in this conversation. They're wanting to sign up for this class. And I think 10 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case. I think there would have been fear or embarrassment, or I don't need this, or diversity is just for Black people, but now it feels like there's much more of an openness among a broader segment of our society to engage in these conversations.
And could I add something too, because it's not just our society. I've been invited. I yesterday spoke to a group of graduate students in Brazil who wanted to talk about diversity and the impact of race on their areas of expertise. And next week, I'm speaking to a group of graduate students at Oxford University in the UK about similar issues. I think that that younger people of all backgrounds are very, very focused right now in trying to get this racism thing under control. And I'm very proud that so many people are interested. But I have this nagging suspicion, and maybe it comes from being I'm probably the oldest of the panelists here because I grew up in the 60s and 70s. Okay, Michael, maybe we're tied. But I believe, and this is very controversial, but I believe that very few white people honestly believe in their heart of hearts that the average Black person is as smart and capable as the average white person. And until that assumption is released, until you see white people not believing in white superiority in any respect, we're going to have a continuation of some of these problems. I think very well-meaning people, nonetheless, just honestly don't believe that we've got it, And so we've got to deal with that. And so the conversation about implicit bias and microaggressions and unconscious bias and stereotyping and stereotype threat as a response to stereotyping, all those things I think are there in part because we still don't have the ability across the board to think of ourselves as equal to one another. And I think, and I'm not saying that people of color don't have their own obnoxious prejudices as well, but I'm saying that I personally believe a big obstacle in the university in particular, where believing in equality of intellect is so important, that we haven't gotten there yet.
Well, that's, again, a really, really important point. It's a great segue into what are some of the root causes of our apparent slowness to inability to succeed in diversifying. I will just second what you said, Anita, and I'll just use an example from a number of organizations that I've been part of where diversity is taken seriously, and we'll have conversations about how to diversify our student body, diversify our faculty. And I can't tell you the number of times in which a conversation about diversity slips into conversations about how to deal with needs to do remedial work, as if diversity and ability were somehow disconnected from each other. And I think it makes the point that you're making about an implicit sense among many whites that that there really is a difference. But that's one, I don't know whether you'd call that a psychological cause of the difficulty we have in addressing this problem effectively, but I'm sure there are structural ones. You hear people talking about the pipeline. It could be a matter of will. Stephanie, do you want to jump in on what your research and your experiences tells you about what some of the causes of the slowness with which we're able to address issues of workplace diversity and culture might be?
Yeah, so, all of the above. It's structural, it's cultural, it's interpersonal, it's individual, it's all of that. But if I were just to say a couple of things that speak to the conversations I typically have is, systems and practices that organizations create to determine who gets opportunity and who's left out of opportunity can vary widely and vary tremendously. And as our colleague at MIT Sloan School of Management, Emilio Castilla, who's done a lot of work on the paradox of meritocracy in organizations, suggests, is that organizational systems are only as good as they are transparent and to which people are accountable. And that's not consistent. We don't always have the same visibility to how the system works. We don't always have people checking to see what the system is yielding. And when it comes to people who are underrepresented, they're not necessarily, all the research, Emilio's research and others, shows that when the systems lack accountability and transparency, people who are in the minority get left behind. So there are systemic reasons in organizations, just like in society, to explain the inequity. I think the other place where I spend a lot of my time is thinking interpersonally about relationships. And there's a long history of research saying we're more attracted to people who are like us. And that we form close relationships with our managers, the people who report to us, with mentors and sponsors based on their similarity to us. And so that's damaging, right? We just talked about the fact that people in the minority are, guess what, in the minority. So this idea that I can only have a relationship with somebody who looks like me, who's like me, is really not an option. And so for me in my research, it's about what are the solutions. I actually build on Dean James's research on this, is what are the solutions that we need to put into place to help people understand that they can effectively mentor, sponsor, build a good, solid relationship with somebody who's different from them. So I've been doing a lot of research recently on allyship. I have a framework that I'm in the midst of trying to publish academically, but I gave the preview in Harvard Business Review this summer, and it's how to be a better ally to your Black colleagues. And it's the framework is called LEAP, but it's there in Harvard Business Review. You can Google it, I won't go through it. But I think giving people tools like that, taking academic science and translating it to some memorable framework, I think has been an opportunity for me and for other scholars as well.
I had a chance to read that piece. It's a great piece, and we do have it on the Canvas site for the preceptorial. If any of the attendees who are part of Penn, unfortunately, it's Penn key protected. But if you're part of Penn and would like to read that piece, it's on the Canvas website for the course. Thank you. Jaya, anything you'd like to add about what we seem to know or think we know about what the root causes of some of these disparities are?
I think they've been, some of the top ones that I was going to talk about have sort of been well delineated. I also have the same feeling that it's sort of a little bit of all of above. Just to go a little further on, we talked about affinity bias, and sort of another one that emerges in academia a lot is something called anchor bias, and our desire to anchor qualifications and success on things like Ivy League education, ignoring the fact that that can be, a byproduct of someone as a legacy student versus individuals or minorities or marginalized populations that may have the ability to get into Ivy League education, Ivy League institutions, but opt for second tier financially because they get a full ride from those schools, et cetera. And so, kind of really looking at our affinity biases and anchor biases in particular in academia is really paramount. I agree. I think coupled to that is just the fact that when you think about the pervasive unconscious bias, affinity, anchor, sort of confirmation bias that occurs when people in higher levels of the organization sort of give micro affirmations to individuals, along the way that they have affinity for. And then when they succeed, it just perpetuates that notion of superiority that Dr. Allen talked about, which is like, oh, of course, I always thought that this person would excel, kind of ignoring their hand and role in that person's success. And in the ways in which they also neglect others within their organization with inadequate sponsorship, et cetera. And I think if you couple that with internalized bias and imposter syndrome, I think you have like the perfect recipe for, some folks to like advance and be promoted throughout an organization and others to sort of fall behind. And then you layer on top of all of that structural racism, which is as well put as before, the ways in which our historical and social political events, coupled with the policies and practices of systems in multiple sectors, have systematically created unequal opportunities for education and employment that allows entry to be disproportionately favored towards one group over another.
Thank you.
Michael, could I point out, I just last night was watching a documentary about Toni Morrison and was reminded that she attended a historically Black university, Howard University, for her undergraduate degree, as did Kamala Harris. And I think we have to ask ourselves, in talking about diversity in our institution, that there are some people who are turning toward majority minority institutions as a domain in which they believe they can have a smoother path of success as undergraduates, as graduate students, and ultimately into their careers. We can see that you don't have to go to the Ivy League to be a great prosecutor or novelist. So we should be humble about what we have to offer people of color, and don't assume that somehow what people of color need is vitally in the hands of white people in majority institutions. To make a little bit more concrete some of the things that were just said about the why of the reasons for some of these problems, I think that that methodology is a huge problem in higher education. That sometimes minorities are excluded because they don't approach their topics in the right way. So in law, for example, there was a whole movement towards critical race scholarship and narrative scholarship and feminist scholarship. And I saw at my own institutions, Georgetown and Penn, people be turned away because they weren't doing traditional, rigorous, legal, analytic scholarship. It's striking to me that that as old as Penn is, 220, 30 years old, we've had 3 Black men on the Penn Law faculty in over 200 years.
No, that's
and only 4 Black women on the Penn Law faculty in over 200 years.
Are you kidding me?
To the philosophy department at Penn, we've had 1 Black professor on the tenure track hired since 1948. And it's all about, I think, it's much about, methodology and approach as about color or race. It's about, it's intellectual affinity, right?
Yep.
And the belief that if you're not doing scholarship the way it's been traditionally done, you don't belong here.
That's an excellent point. And I should point out that the current dean of the Annenberg School, John Jackson, is a Howard graduate as well. So, Erika, would you like to add to this conversation?
But there's not much more I can add, but I would like to just highlight tangentially, there's so much focus right now on the systemic aspects of racism and inequity. And I think that can get lost because I don't know that there's a real clear and common understanding of what we mean when we say systemic. And I remember in graduate school, and it was time to write my dissertation, and I just kept having this image of this tune that I had to write, and it was daunting and paralyzing. And I think by some token, the notion of systemic racism is similar. It seems unapproachable because it's so massive and so embedded in every fabric of society that we don't know what to do, and so we just become paralyzed and don't do anything. So I think part of the conversation is, how do we break down this notion of systemic racism into manageable pieces that any of us as individuals or individual leaders can own, right? And so what does it look like to look at just the selection and attraction processes for an organization when they're looking to recruit talent? And let's just focus on that issue as opposed to this behemoth notion of systemic racism, which nobody feels they can get their hands around, so nobody does anything.
That's a really important point, and it also can become an excuse for not doing anything as well if it feels like it's out of your hands. Really, really important point. Let's spend a little bit of time now, hopefully in a way that can be, although you've already begun to touch on some of these things, it can be a little bit more in the direction of solutions. What works? You've all hinted at things, but do we know what works in terms of improving workplace diversity and culture? Are there things that haven't been tried, but that you suspect might be a solution to some of these issues? Erika, since you're still on the screen, maybe you could start us off. I should also say, Erika, that we can hear you fine, but there's a little scratchiness in I don't know whether your microphone is, and it may just be my screen, but we can hear you fine. So
I'm sorry, I don't know how to address that.
no, that's fine. We can hear you.
So in terms of what works, I don't think we know yet. I think that there have been a lot of experiments and fits and starts with different things, but I think the challenge is we've not sustained any one effort long enough to really have the impact that is necessary. So there's a tremendous amount to do and a tremendous amount of things to try and a tremendous amount of experimentation that still needs to happen. But I think one thing that's critical is there has to be the intention of seeing something through for a sustained period of time. And without that focused intention, this too will, in a year from now, perhaps disappear from people's line of sight and they go back to doing things as normal, because it's hard work. And it's work that oftentimes competes with other aspects of running a business. And without the intention, and I would say, going back to something that Stephanie said, without allyship of people who are already in positions of power, it will be increasingly difficult to move forward. So building the right kinds of relationships with people who are genuinely interested in seeing sustained change has to be a part of the algorithm.
Michael, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
You think I would have learned that by now. Jaya, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I agree with Dean James that I think this is, I think we're at the stage of defining the problems and figuring out how to operationalize the concepts. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of testing critical interventions and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. And I think in many ways in medicine, we've borrowed from our Wharton colleagues in terms of what they've tried and tried to apply it in our spaces. In terms of structured interviews, potential for priming techniques post-interview to screen for affinity biases. And we're doing some randomized controlled trials and some of the residency programs around that, really borrowing from other sectors, because I think medicine has a long way to go in terms of where we are in this space. I think the other thing we've focused on too is just back to basics in terms of effective measurement and metrics. I don't think we're all talking about the same things when we use the words diversity, representation, and inclusion. And as simplistic as that sounds, it actually makes a difference. So before our study came out last year, LCME was touting that they were increasing they were doing well on diversity based on their metrics, but they were using absolute numbers and they weren't doing it proportional to age-based population changes. We also put out this idea of so is it proportionate to the growing and changing demographics of the society nationwide? But also are you diversifying it relative to the population you're serving in healthcare? And so things like representation quotient, where, a place like Vermont can be doing quite well in terms of representing the population they're serving because it's largely homogenous, but Philadelphia and our healthcare systems, we have a long way to go because, we have no ethnic majority and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the population we serve, and we need to match it and rise to that occasion. The other thing we found in our studies was, to what Dr. Allen had mentioned, was when you look at diversity in the medical fields, 50% of physicians, diverse physicians across the nation, are supplied by HBCUs or historically minority serving institutions. So the brunt of diversifying our physician workforce across the nation is bared by these critical institutions. And I think laden in that is partial solutions. Like, why are they successful? What is the culture there? And what can we borrow and learn? And then also laden is that is that the right way to do this? Like, why should a small group of institutions bear that sort of challenge and opportunity of supplying the diverse physician workforce across the nation, knowing that simultaneously 50% of physicians end up staying where they train? And so you're going to continue to have maldistribution of your workforce based on that. And so some of the things around us defining what our metrics are and being smarter and wiser about our strategic planning is what we're thinking about.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. Anita, I know that you did a lot of work on this in your time as vice provost, and you also worked with the various deans, myself included. Were there models or approaches, or from your larger working with other universities, that seemed like they were ways to address this issue?
Michael, I actually found a great deal of joy in working with diversity and inclusion issues at Penn. And part of that joy came from the feeling that there were concrete things that I could do and I could encourage others to do that did make a difference. So, working on building a pipeline, by the way, first of all, having a strategic plan around diversity and inclusion, which a lot of institutions don't have, is a vital starting point. And when I entered my role in 2013, we were 2 years into an action plan for diversity, faculty diversity, and we stuck to the plan and we kept sticking to the plan. And it included nurturing the pipeline. It included financial incentives to departments for hiring more diversely, hiring people of color, hiring more women. It included supporting better the packages that our young scholars of color and women scholars need to be good, effective researchers and scientists. It included requiring formal mentorship programs, supporting mentorship programs and sponsorship programs across the schools. And the School of Medicine was a vital partner in all of this, by the way, as were several other schools. So there were specific things that we worked on. We worked on unconscious bias training, and there's, the jury's out on whether that actually works, but I saw some very important conversations happen in some of the better sessions that were aimed at educating our faculty about unconscious bias. So there are things you can do, and I love the idea of putting your hands on the problem and trying really hard to make a difference. And I do think that there are things that are worth trying. Did the numbers change dramatically? I think they changed importantly, right? And some of the changes were, so for example, before 2013, there were no full-time professional staff who were Black in the provost office. And by the time I left, we had a Black provost. And, so I saw very, dramatically changes happen at the highest levels. A female athletic director, right? A Black provost, the vet school finally hiring a Black tenure track professor. I mean, they're small differences in a way, but they're dramatic, important, symbolic, but deeply symbolic, and I think influential changes that an institution like Penn can make. And I hope that all of us who do this work won't feel discouraged by the fact that the numbers and the research about the numbers suggest that our success has been modest, because it can be very, very rewarding to be part of the effort to make some changes happen.
I agree with that. The other change, at least it seemed like from my end, Anita, but you can tell me, is the creation of diversity officer positions in the different schools, which I think came out of some of the initiatives that you were working on.
Yeah,
Really,
absolutely.
someone whose job it was to think about and work on these issues.
So the year I was hired, Eve Higginbotham was hired. Dr. Eve Higginbotham was hired in the medical school to work on diversity, and she and I were great. Had a great partnership. But when I saw how effective her role was in the medical school, I began to encourage other schools to hire diversity officers, and many did. Nursing hired, and on and on and on. So I think that was an important move to focus the faculty's attention, and to educate the faculty about the importance of diversity and inclusion, and to point a path forward. So that's I think that's a good thing to have done. But again, and also, the school action plan. So the university had a plan, but we asked the schools to write their own plans. And then some large departments wrote their own strategic plan around diversity. So, planning and being very intentional, using Dr. James's word, being very intentional about these efforts, I think is what we need to be focusing on. I think, it works in higher education. I think it probably could work in many industries as well.
Thank you. Stephanie, your thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. Let me apologize in advance. I've gotten one warning that says my internet connection is unstable, so I will come back if I freeze. But I want to say that what motivated the study that I started talking about initially, the inclusion in the workplace study, was this understanding that there are actually so many things that institutions and companies that I study have been doing for a very long time. And what's driving their sense of, are we doing enough, is based on, can we check the box on all the things that one could possibly do? So in the first year of our study, we set out to interview people who were chief diversity officers, talent management vice presidents, chief human resource officers, people analytics leaders, all the people who are responsible for all of these activities. And we found no fewer than 100 different things that they were trying and not entirely sure if they were working. So it wasn't a question of, are we doing anything? It was a question of do we actually know with it, are we measuring the relationship between practices and outcomes? So that's what my study is focusing on, is not just what are we doing and what do we want to achieve, but what is the link between these things? And so just to give you a quick preview, like I said, we have a public facing report that will come out hopefully in May. We have 6 MBA students working on this. The academic study is about something totally different. But the public-facing study is focused on these 7 categories of practices that we know many of the most advanced organizations are engaging in. And just to rattle them off, one is called internal diversity partners. That's where they have people whose formal job is not responsibility. So they're not the chief diversity officer. So whether this is a diversity council or an employer business resource group, that's one category of activity. Another one is mentoring and sponsorship. We've heard that a lot here tonight. Another is workplace policy. So flexible work arrangements, work from home, things like that. The fourth is education and training, that unconscious bias training, the speaker series. The fifth is managerial involvement. So this is the only one that's not necessarily organizationally focused, but focused on your direct manager. What's the extent to which your manager actually talks about diversity, equity, inclusion with the team? The sixth is physical visibility. Do you see people who look like you represented in the pictures on the walls and the statues and all of that lovely conversation of stuff? Is something that organizations are continuing to think about. And the last is diversity recruiting. And this is what we've heard a lot around HBCU recruiting from women's institutions. So if those are the 7 categories, we have 12 outcomes, won't go through theirs. We're looking and seeing what's driving what. So just for an even earlier preview, if you go to the Wharton People Analytics website, wpa.wharton.upenn.edu, and just scroll down a little bit. Again, that's wpa.wharton.upenn.edu. Scroll down a little bit, you'll see something called Evidence-Based Solutions for Inclusion in the Workplace, Actions for Middle Managers. We released that short white paper, it's about 10 pages long, in May. And we gave what drives, we actually just focused on belonging and turnover intent as 2 of our 12 outcomes we wanted to give people a little bit of a teaser around. And so we show of those 7 practices in our study up until that time, what were the 3 or the 4 practices that actually were driving that outcome. Wasn't saying that all these other things weren't important. It was saying that those weren't driving the outcome. So that's where we're headed, and we're excited to be able to release that when it's done.
That's great. That sounds like a really practical, data-driven approach to this, which I really support. That's great. So for the next couple of minutes, I just want to ask a couple of the questions that have come from our audience, and I'm going to paraphrase by putting them into several questions that are generally on the same topic together. One of the questions had to do with this notion of having an ally and the problem that emerges when people want to work with or mentor or hire or promote people that are like themselves. And there were several questions to try to get at the idea, why is it that being like ourselves has to be based on gender and skin color? Is there any research or any thinking that you have on other ways in which the similarity across people can be on other levels, so that people then realize that they are like these other people that might be different from them in one way, but very similar to them in other ways? Does difference always have to come down to, or similarity always have to come down to skin color and gender, I guess is what the questions seem to be focusing on. And anyone want to jump in on that?
So I'd love to just share something very simple, and perhaps Dr. Aysola can correct me if this is wrong, but it's my understanding that at a molecular level, human beings across race and gender are 99.9% alike at the most fundamental level. So this notion of demographic differences that divide us is socially constructed.
Yeah. And
at our core, we are all fundamentally the same. So let me just put that out there as a teaser for the rest of the conversation.
That's great.
This question gives me an opportunity to say something I wanted to say tonight, which is that many of our families are multicultural. All right, we come to the workplace, wearing a black skin and having all black culture, or Asian culture or Hispanic culture or German culture, but we may be living with a partner who's from a different country or different race. And we know how to do that. We know how to make those relationships work. As it so happens, my very best friend in the whole world is a white woman whose family comes from England and Ireland. And we are so much alike, you wouldn't believe it. But still, I must say, I feel comfortable and more comfortable in an academic workplace when there are other Black African-American women in the environment. And it's not because I don't believe that I can be friends with white people or live with white people. It's just that that ultimate, that sense that I'm not being held back because of who I am. That sense is relieved when I see others who look like me in the workplace. And I assume it's the same for most other people as well, that it's not that we think we can't be friends with or can't be alike someone who's very racially or culturally or nationally different, but it's just that when we do see people like us, it assures us that we're not being held back because of the way we look.
That's a really
or
good
sound
point.
or where we're from.
Any other thoughts on that issue?
Yeah. First, to underscore what Dean James said, absolutely, race is not a biological construct. There are no, substantiated biological differences between races. But, this affinity bias that we have, it's a really interesting bias. And so I think, whether someone reminds you of your grandfather's smile, whether you went to the same high school, whether you had some sort of the same synagogue or church, the kind of anchoring that we do when we have this sort of instant unconscious connection with someone oftentimes falls along racial and ethnic lines. The chances that you would have that affinity if someone's from the same background, be it racial, ethnic, or gender, is greater. We know that when we look at it. And so in an interview or something like that, when you have that instant unconscious bias and that affinity bias, it does fall along those lines. But to Dean James' point, given there's so much that connects us, could an intervention, I was just talking about this with my a research team, could we change affinity bias? And can we flip it as an intervention? We talk about it as a problem. Can we create affinity? Can we create, can we create interventions that sort of drive people to find their shared humanity in an interview process as a potential intervention? Can we do it the other way rather than trying to suppress that affinity bias?
That's a great point. That's a very hopeful point as well. The other thing, I'm going to ask one more kind of question that emerges from several of the questions that we've gotten from the audience, and it has to do with our conversation about systematic bias and how it can be so, that it's there, but it can be so overwhelming that it either is an excuse or is paralyzing in terms of acting and trying to make change. And while a number of the people in the audience got that point, there was some concern expressed that one of the problems is that, and these are my words now, not the question askers, that a large percentage of the white majority in the United States just doesn't believe that there is anything like structural bias as regards racism. And I know from doing public opinion research that there's some truth to that whites and blacks differ dramatically on their sense of whether there is systematic institutional biases that still exist against blacks. And so the questions basically were, what do we do? How do we try to educate the larger white, in this case, population to the kinds of biases that blacks, African Americans do still face in the United States? Part of what we can do is what I hope this preceptorial is trying to do. But do you have other thoughts either about the basic premise or of those kinds of questions, or what might be done to make it clear to the larger population that this is not just a matter of individual behavior at this point?
I have a couple of things that I just want to say, and then I'll pass it on to my colleagues. But I want to validate this with, anecdotal data, but it's data nonetheless. One is an email that I received, which from time to time I receive these emails from people who don't love the things that I have to say. And the email I received today was, you're still talking about systemic racism, you're actually part of the problem, right? So it's real. And then the executive order that our current president put out in October saying we can't talk about systemic racism. So it's a very real polarizing, viewpoint that exists. And so what can be done about it? As I've been talking to leaders this summer, I've been thinking about the companies that are actually doing a good job of keeping this conversation open. Ben & Jerry's is one of the ones I always like to mention because they have a website, and it's 7 ways on their website, there's a page called 7 Ways You Know Systemic Racism is Real. And they go through all of the systems to talk about the data. Sometimes I will say it is the difference between not knowing and not wanting to know. That's not the same thing. Some people don't know and some people just don't want to know. And I say, let's worry about the people who don't know. Right now, I can't be as concerned about the people who don't want to know, because that requires a different type of intervention. You can't use the same mechanism to address that resistance, but with science and knowledge, you can address the ones who don't know and want to know, perhaps.
Yeah. Excellent points. Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on this particular issue?
This is a little naive, but I do think that if more occasions were available for people of different backgrounds to listen to one another's experiences, then you can begin to understand the reality behind the very complicated concept of systematic or structural differences. It's a very hard concept to grasp, but it's not hard to grasp that if you go in to buy a planter, as I recently did, at the Lowe's hardware store on 52nd Street in West Philadelphia, it might be that you're going to get the second quality of the same product that you could also buy in the suburban store. I mean, I literally had this experience where in the minority serving Lowe's store, the planters, the nails weren't in straight and they were dirty and they were bent. And I went to the suburban store and they were all, pristine, clean, and the nails were. And so I thought, wow, I mean, we are being served inferior products, in the Black community. And that's systemic racism.
Great example.
Yeah.
Well, I'm cognizant of time, so and I don't want to hold either panelists or the audience up longer than we had agreed to. But and I apologize to the attendees whose questions we were unable to get to. Before we end, though, I want to encourage our audience members to attend our next panel, which focuses on America's housing system. The panel will take place on Thursday, November 19th, just next week, from 5 to 6:15. And we'll be sending out invitations about this very, very soon. The Panelists is another great set of experts. They include Penn's Provost and Presidential Professor of Law School and the Graduate School of Education, Wendell Pritchett, Assistant Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning, Vincent Riena, Sussman Professor and Professor of Real Estate and Finance at the Wharton School and Co-Director of the Institute for Urban Research, Susan Wachter, all three of whom have recently co-authored a book on this topic of fair housing. And they'll be joined by Associate Professor in the School of Social Policy and Practice, Amy Hillier, and I'm happy to say the President of the National Urban League and Penn alum, Mark Morial, will be joining them on that panel. So please try to join us if you can. And with that, I'd really like to thank our panelists. I know I learned a lot from this discussion. I hope our audience did as well. I enjoyed it greatly. I'm leaving with more hope. I should say that going to the point of systemic racism, that public opinion polling suggests that the current moment of demonstrations and protests and calls for change does appear to be moving white public opinion to better understand these issues. So there's another example of where public action can really change hearts and minds, hopefully in a way that will be lasting. But I want to thank the panelists very much. I want to thank our audience. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope I'll see you at future panels. Take care, everyone. Thank you.